One of the twin infants' screams pierced through the luxurious first-class train compartment like a relentless alarm, sharp and unforgiving. The other twin soon joined in a chorus of despair that made fellow passengers shift uncomfortably in their leather seats, exchanging pointed glances. But no one dared voice a complaint, not when they saw the man cradling both infants. Howard Mayers sat with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to absolute control, his broad shoulders tense beneath an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Visible tattoos crept up from his collar. Intricate Celtic knots and symbols that marked him as someone from a world most passengers pretended didn't exist. His strong, bearded jaw was clenched tight enough to shatter stone. Those piercing eyes, normally cold and calculating enough to make grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed, now held something entirely foreign. Panic. Raw, unfiltered panic. The twins, Jay and Jesse, 2 months old and identical save for a small birthmark on Jay's temple, continued their desperate wailing, tiny fists beating against their father's chest, 2 months since they'd entered this world. 2 months since Loretta had taken her last breath bringing them into it. 2 months since Howard Mayers, the most feared man in the American underground, had become something he never imagined possible. Helpless. "Sir!" One of his men leaned in carefully, his voice barely audible over the crying. Tattoos marked his knuckles, a clear sign of his allegiance. "We could arrange for the train to make an unscheduled stop. I can have..." "No." Howard's voice carried that dangerous silk that made men's blood run cold. "We maintain the schedule." But the twins didn't care about schedules. They didn't care that their father controlled criminal operations spanning 3 states. That politicians crossed the street to avoid his shadow. That entire families had vanished at his word. The infants only knew hunger, discomfort, and the devastating absence of the warmth they'd known for 8 precious weeks before it was stolen away. Howard had tried everything. Bottles prepared by the nanny waiting at their destination. Pacifiers that both boys rejected with surprising force. Rocking motions that felt awkward in arms more accustomed to violence than tenderness. Nothing worked. 3 rows ahead, Laura Cottle heard those desperate cries and felt her body betray her with an instinctive response. Her breasts ached with sympathetic letdown, milk threatening to soak through the nursing pads she still wore despite the fact that... She closed her eyes, forcing down the familiar wave of grief. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she'd held her own daughter. 6 months since Marta's tiny heart had simply stopped beating in the night. No explanation, no warning. Just the clinical words, sudden infant death syndrome, as if labeling the nightmare somehow made it survivable. Laura had been returning from a grief counseling conference in Chicago, attempting to stitch together the fragments of her shattered existence. She was a pediatric nurse. Had been one anyway. After losing Marta, she couldn't force herself back into the NICU, couldn't watch other mothers cradle thriving babies while hers lay forever cold beneath the earth. The crying intensified and Laura felt tears prick her own eyes. She recognized that sound with professional certainty, the desperate, hungry wail of infants who needed something primal, something only a mother could provide. Her hands trembled against the armrests. "Miss, are you all right?" The attendant paused beside her seat, concerned. Laura looked up, then back toward the source of the crying. "That baby, those babies, they sound... I'm a nurse. Maybe I could help?" The attendant's expression shifted between relief and apprehension. "The gentleman has been rather firm about declining assistance, but if you'd like to try, I suppose it couldn't make matters worse." Laura unbuckled her seatbelt before rational thought could intervene, following the attendant down the aisle. With each step, her pulse hammered harder. This was madness. She was still lactating, her body stubbornly refusing to accept there was no longer an infant to feed, but she couldn't simply offer to breastfeed a stranger's children. Could she? Especially not twins. Then she saw him. Howard Mayers sat like a king on a throne, even in distress. Dark hair swept back from a face that appeared carved from granite by an unforgiving hand. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed by a precisely maintained beard, and eyes so intense they seemed to consume light rather than reflect it. Intricate tattoos decorated his visible neck and hands, marking him as dangerous. He wore power like armor, and threat radiated from him in waves that made her survival instincts scream to retreat, but the twins in his arms looked so impossibly small against that broad, tattooed chest. Both infants' faces were crimson from crying, tiny features contorted in shared misery. "Sir," the attendant began nervously, "this passenger is a nurse. She thought she might—" Howard's gaze snapped to Laura, and she felt the impact like a physical blow. Those eyes could strip secrets from souls, could make the innocent confess to imagined sins. For a heartbeat, Laura forgot how to breathe. "A nurse," he repeated, his voice low and rough like gravel wrapped in expensive velvet. An accent lingered at the edges, Irish perhaps, though smoothed by years in America. "Pediatric," Laura heard herself say, though her voice sounded distant. I know that cry. They're hungry." "I've tried bottles." Frustration cracked through Howard's controlled exterior like fault lines in ice. "They refuse, both of them." Laura's gaze moved from the intimidating man to the suffering infants, and something in her chest fractured open. The twins' cries had taken on a desperate edge, the kind that spoke of genuine distress. She'd heard it too many times in the NICU, and her body responded before conscious thought could intervene. "Some babies won't accept artificial nipples," she said softly, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming to flee from this dangerous man, especially if they were breastfed initially. Was their mother? Something shifted in Howard's expression, a flash of such raw agony that Laura caught her breath. "She died," he said flatly, 8 weeks ago, bringing them into this world." The compartment seemed to fall silent around them. Though the twins still cried, Laura's eyes burned with unshed tears, her grief recognizing his even as her professional training engaged. "Then they're probably rejecting the bottles because they're searching for something familiar," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something they associate with safety and comfort." Their eyes locked, and Laura saw the precise moment comprehension dawned. His jaw tightened, and for a second she thought he might order her away. But then Jay released another desperate wail, Jesse joining him immediately after. And something in the untouchable Mafia boss crumbled. "Are you offering what I think you're offering?" His voice carried danger and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. Laura swallowed hard. This was insanity. This was beyond insanity. But the twins were suffering, and her body was producing milk with nowhere to go, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could save these tiny lives even though she'd failed to save her own. "I'm still producing," she admitted, heat flooding her cheeks. "I lost my daughter 6 months ago. My body I haven't been able to stop it. If you'd allow me, I could try." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every passenger in first class had gone quiet, sensing they were witnessing something profound, even if they couldn't fully comprehend what. Howard Mayers stared at this woman, this stranger who had just offered the most intimate gift one human could give another, and felt reality shift beneath him. In his world, there were no gifts. Everything carried a price, every kindness concealed a blade. But this woman's eyes held only compassion and a grief that mirrored his own. "The sleeper car," he said abruptly, standing with fluid grace despite cradling both infants. "It's more private." Laura's heart hammered as she followed him through the train, acutely aware of the tattooed man who materialized to walk behind them. This was real. This was actually happening. The private sleeper compartment was small but luxurious, designed for overnight journeys. Howard stood in the doorway, his large frame consuming most of the space, uncertainty written across features that probably hadn't shown doubt in decades. "I'll step outside," he said finally, his voice rough. "Unless you need." "I'll be fine," Laura assured him, though her hands trembled as she reached for the twin. "What are their names?" "Jay and Jesse." The words emerged like both prayer and curse. "After my grandfather and my wife's father." Laura took the infants carefully, one cradled in each arm, a skill honed from years in the NICU. Their cries had diminished to hiccuping whimpers as if sensing change was coming. She looked up at Howard, at this dangerous, powerful man who had just entrusted her with his most precious possessions, and saw a vulnerability that stole her breath. "I'll take care of them," she promised. Howard nodded once, sharp and controlled, then stepped back to let her close the door. The moment it clicked shut, Laura felt the weight of what she was about to do settle over her. Her hands moved automatically, unbuttoning her blouse with the efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. The nursing bra came next, and then she was positioning Jay at her breast, supporting his tiny head the way she'd supported so many infants in her career. For a moment, nothing happened. Jay whimpered, turning his face against her skin, searching. Then instinct took over and he latched on, and Laura felt the familiar pull and release as he began to nurse. Tears streamed silently down her face as she looked down at the infant in her arms. He wasn't Marta, he would never be Marta, but he was a child who needed comfort, who needed nourishment, who needed the one thing her body was still desperately trying to provide. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, stroking his dark hair. After several minutes, she carefully switched to Jesse, who latched on just as eagerly. The coordination required, nursing twins felt both foreign and natural, her body remembering skills it had never actually practiced. Outside the door, Howard Mayers stood with fists clenched at his sides, his man wisely maintaining distance. The silence that had replaced his son's cries was simultaneously relief and torment. He'd just handed Jay and Jesse to a complete stranger. He who trusted no one, who vetted the background of every person who came within 10 feet of his children, had just given his sons to a woman whose last name he didn't even know. But something about her had penetrated the armor he'd built around himself. Perhaps it was the grief in her eyes that matched his own. Perhaps it was the desperate courage required to offer such intimate kindness to a stranger. Or perhaps it was simply that for the first time in 8 weeks, someone had offered help without wanting something in return. And when the door opened 20 minutes later, Laura emerged with both twins sleeping peacefully in her arms. Jay's tiny fist was curled against her chest, Jesse's head resting in the crook of her other arm, both completely at peace. Howard looked at his sons, truly peaceful for the first time since Loretta's death, and felt something shift in his chest, something dangerous, something that in his world could get people killed. "They're asleep," Laura said unnecessarily, her voice soft to avoid waking the infants. "They both ate well. They should sleep for a few hours now." She moved to return them, but Howard's hand shot out to stop her, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with surprising gentleness for a man capable of such violence. "Your name," he demanded, though his tone had lost its edge. Laura Cottle. Howard Mayers." He released her wrist, taking the twins from her arms with practiced care. Neither stirred, too content to wake. "I owe you a debt, Laura Cottle." "You don't owe me anything." Laura began buttoning her blouse, suddenly aware of how intimate this situation was. "I was happy to help. In my world, everything comes with a price." Howard's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And what you just did, feeding my sons, giving them peace when nothing else could, that's not something I can simply walk away from." Something in his tone made Laura's heart race with more than simple attraction. It sounded almost like a warning, like a prophecy. "I should return to my seat." "Wait!" The word was command, not request. Howard shifted both twins to one arm with the ease of someone who'd been doing this alone for weeks, then produced a card from his suit pocket. "You'll come with us. To my home." "What? No, I can't." "They'll need you again." His voice had gone soft, dangerous. "The bottles won't work any better tomorrow than they did today. You gave my sons something precious. The least you can do is see it through." Laura knew she should refuse. Everything about this man screamed danger, from the way other passengers averted their eyes when he passed to the tattooed bodyguard who shadowed his movements. But there was something in his expression when he looked at his sons, a vulnerability that called to her own broken heart. And the twins, they needed her. "How long?" she found herself asking. "A week, maybe 2. Until I can find another solution." His eyes held hers. "I'll compensate you. Whatever you need." Laura looked down at Jay and Jesse sleeping peacefully in their father's arms and felt that familiar ache in her chest, the one that had been hollow since Marta died. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come." A ghost of something, not quite a smile, touched Howard's lips, transforming his face from dangerous to devastatingly handsome. "Good." Laura returned to her seat in a daze, the warmth of the twins' small bodies still imprinted on her skin. She didn't notice the way Howard's man was already making calls, didn't see the calculating look in Howard's eyes as he watched her walk away, his sleeping sons cradled against his chest. In his world, in the world of the Irish-American Mafia, where tradition ran deeper than blood, what had just happened wasn't simple. It wasn't just a kind stranger helping children in need. In the old ways, the ways his grandfather had taught him, the ways that still governed the ancient families, a woman who nursed a Don's heirs became bound to that family, became bound to him, and Howard Mayers always honored the old ways. Before we dive into this story, I need to know, would you have offered to help a dangerous stranger's child? Drop yes or no way in the comments right now. And if your team love is worth any sacrifice, hit that like button so I know you're here for the emotional roller coaster. Laura's legs felt unsteady as she approached Howard Mayers' seat. The twins' cries pulling her forward like a magnetic force she couldn't resist. Up close, the man was even more intimidating. The Celtic knot tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse with each breath, and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker, more dangerous. "I'm sorry to intrude," she began, her voice barely audible over the crying. "But I'm a pediatric nurse, and I think I can help." Howard's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment the mask of control slipped entirely. She saw something in those dark depths that made her own grief rise up like a tide, a recognition soul-deep and undeniable. He was drowning just as she had been drowning for 6 months. "They won't stop," he said quietly, and the raw admission from this clearly powerful man nearly broke her. Jay squirmed in his arms, his tiny face red and tear-streaked, while Jesse's cries had taken on a hoarse quality that spoke of hours of distress. Laura's professional instincts warred with something more primal. "May I?" She gestured toward the infants, and Howard shifted, allowing her closer. She placed a gentle hand on Jay's chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat, then touched Jesse's forehead. Both were warm but not feverish, hungry, not sick. How long since their mother? She couldn't finish the question. 8 weeks. Howard's jaw tightened. Loretta. Her name was Loretta. Marta, Laura whispered back, surprising herself. My daughter, 6 months ago. The compartment seemed to contract around them, the noise of the train fading to nothing, and two strangers bound by the worst kind of loss, standing in the wreckage of their respective grief. Howard's eyes searched hers, and she saw the moment he understood that she wasn't offering help out of pity or obligation, but out of necessity. Her own need to fill the void that Marta had left behind. I'm still producing milk, Laura said, the words tumbling out in a rush. My body won't stop. If they need, if you'd let me, I could nurse them, both of them. She expected shock, perhaps disgust. Instead, Howard's expression shifted to something that looked almost like hope, fragile and dangerous. You would do that? His voice had dropped to barely a whisper. For my sons? For them, Laura confirmed, her eyes on the twins. Because I understand what it's like to fail a child, and I won't do that again if I can help it. Howard stood abruptly, the twins still cradled against his chest. Come with me. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. Something in between, urgent and desperate. He led her through the swaying train car, his bodyguard materializing from nowhere to follow at a discreet distance. They passed curious passengers and reached the sleeper compartment at the end, its door bearing a small brass plate that read Private. Howard opened it with one hand, somehow managing to balance both infants with practiced efficiency. The space inside was intimate, a cushioned bench that converted to a bed, soft lighting, and windows showing the landscape rushing past. You're certain? He asked, pausing in the doorway. Laura looked at the crying twins, at their tiny fists and scrunched faces, and felt her milk let down in response. Her body knew what they needed, even if her mind was screaming that this was insane. I'm certain. Howard stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them away from the world outside. For better or worse, Laura Cottle had just crossed a threshold she could never uncross. And as she reached for the first twin, she realized she didn't want to go back. Howard stepped outside the sleeper compartment, positioning himself like a sentinel in the narrow corridor. His hands were still warm from where he'd held his sons, and he flexed his fingers, trying to dispel the strange sensation crawling up his spine. Vulnerability mixed with something far more dangerous. Inside, he could hear the soft sounds of Laura settling in, the rustle of fabric, then silence, then miraculously more silence. No crying, no desperate wails, just the rhythmic sound of the train on the tracks. His chest tightened. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Howard had orchestrated deals worth millions in less time, had given orders that ended lives without hesitation, but standing outside that door while a stranger, a woman whose last name he'd only just learned, fed his sons was perhaps the most powerless he'd felt since watching Loretta take her last breath. When the door finally opened, the sight that greeted him nearly brought him to his knees. Laura stood there with both twins cradled in her arms, one against each breast, their tiny mouths working in perfect synchronization. Jay's hand was curled around her finger, Jesse's head resting in the crook of her elbow. Both were feeding peacefully, their faces relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. And Laura, her face was wet with silent tears, but there was something almost transcendent in her expression. Peace. Purpose. The kind of bone-deep satisfaction that came from filling a need so primal, it bypassed all rational thought. They're both eating, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They needed to feed together. Twins often do, they comfort each other. Howard couldn't speak. Something was shifting inside his chest, something that felt like tectonic plates rearranging the landscape of his soul. This woman had given his sons what he couldn't, what no amount of money or power could buy. She'd given them life itself. In his world, debts were currency. Debts were leverage. Debts were how you controlled people, how you maintained power. But this debt, this was different. This was sacred. "You'll come home with me," he said, and even he could hear how rough his voice had become. "To my estate. You'll stay until they're stable." Laura looked up sharply, her eyes widening. "I can't just—" "You can." Howard stepped closer, careful not to disturb the feeding twins. "You will. They need you, Laura. Look at them." She did look down, and he saw the exact moment her resolve crumbled. Jay had finished and was drowsing against her skin, his tiny fist still clutching her finger like an anchor. Laura adjusted, lifting him gently to her shoulder to burp him while simultaneously repositioning Jesse, moving with a coordination that spoke of years of professional experience, but also something more instinctive, more maternal. Howard reached out to take Jay, and their hands brushed as they made the transfer. The contact sent electricity through his arm, and from the sharp intake of her breath, she'd felt it too. He cradled his son against his chest, feeling the infant's contentment in every relaxed muscle. "This isn't a request," Howard said quietly, watching as Jesse continued to nurse. "In my family there are traditions, old ways. When a woman nurses a Don's children, she becomes bound to them, to him. It's an honor, but it's also a responsibility." "What are you saying?" Laura's voice trembled. Howard's mind raced with thoughts he couldn't voice aloud. The ancient code his grandfather had drilled into him as a boy. The traditions that still governed the oldest families. The rules that transcended even modern sensibilities. By feeding his heirs, both of them the twin sons of the Dawn, she had entered into a contract older than law itself. She was theirs now, or more accurately, she was his. The queen to his king, the mother to his sons, bound by blood, even if it wasn't her own blood, even if the bond had been forged through milk rather than marriage. And "I'm saying you've given my sons a gift beyond price," he said instead, his voice soft, but carrying an undercurrent of iron. "And I protect what's mine. You're under my care now, Laura Cottle, whether you realize it or not." Jesse finished feeding, and Laura lifted him to her shoulder, now cradling both twins with expert efficiency. She looked up at Howard, and he saw the war in her eyes, fear battling with need, self-preservation fighting against maternal instinct. "1 week," she finally whispered. "I'll give you 1 week to find another solution." Howard nodded, accepting the compromise even though he knew the truth. She wasn't leaving in a week. She was never leaving. The moment she'd offered to feed his sons, the moment that first drop of milk had touched their lips, she'd sealed both their fates. The old ways had claimed her. The train station was a blur of activity that Laura barely registered. One moment she was gathering her single carry-on bag. The next she was being ushered into a sleek black SUV with windows so dark she couldn't see through them. Howard sat beside her, the twins sleeping peacefully in their car seats between them, while 2 men with visible weapons sat in the front. "Where exactly are we going?" Laura asked, her voice thin. "Home," Howard replied simply, as if that explained everything. The motorcade, because that's what it was, she realized with growing unease, 3 identical SUVs moving in formation. Traveled for nearly an hour outside the city. They passed through increasingly rural areas until finally turning onto a private road marked only by a discreet call box and cameras she could see positioned in the trees. The estate that emerged from the woods made Laura's breath catch. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress disguised as a mansion. 3 stories of stone and glass sprawled across manicured grounds, surrounded by walls that seemed designed more for keeping people out than aesthetic appeal. Men in dark suits patrolled the perimeter, and she counted at least 4 guard stations before they even reached the main entrance. "Jesus," she whispered. "What are you?" Howard's expression remained neutral as the SUV pulled to a stop beneath a covered portico. "I'm a businessman, Laura, but my business requires certain precautions." A businessman. The lie was so transparent it almost insulted her intelligence. The tattoos, the guards, the weapons, the fortress, this was the home of someone who operated far outside the law. This was the estate of a man whose title Howard's men had used with reverence. The Don. Laura's stomach twisted as the full weight of her decision crashed over her. She'd agreed to come home with a Mafia boss. She'd walked willingly into what might very well be a gilded cage. "I want to leave," she said suddenly, her hand on the door handle. "You can't." Howard's voice was gentle but firm. "Not yet. They need you." As if on cue, Jay stirred in his car seat and began to whimper. Within seconds, Jesse joined him, and the peaceful silence shattered into familiar chaos. Inside the mansion, a gray-haired woman in pristine clothes rushed forward. The nanny, Laura presumed. But when she tried to offer bottles to the crying twins, both boys turned their heads away violently, their cries escalating to screams that echoed through the cavernous entryway. "They've been like this since you left them on the train," the nanny said, her Irish accent thick with worry. "They took a bit from the bottle after they woke, but now they won't have it at all. It's been hours, Mr. Mayers. They need to eat." Howard's face had gone pale beneath his tan. He took Jesse from the nanny's arms, then reached for Jay, cradling both sons against his chest as they screamed. Laura watched his composure crack, watched the powerful Don become just a terrified father watching his children suffer. "Laura." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. "Please, I know you're frightened. I know this isn't what you expected, but they're starving. They're going to." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Laura could hear it in the twins' cries, the desperate, weakening quality that spoke of true distress. As a pediatric nurse, she knew what happened to infants who refused to eat: dehydration, failure to thrive, organ failure, death. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Since this morning, 8 hours, maybe more." Howard's voice cracked. "Please, Laura, I'm begging you, save my sons." She'd never heard a man like Howard Mayers beg for anything. The sound of it, raw and desperate and utterly genuine, shattered the last of her resistance. "Take me to the nursery," she said. The relief that flooded Howard's face was almost painful to witness. He nodded once, sharp and grateful, then led her deeper into his fortress, his crying sons cradled in his arm, but their fate resting entirely in her hands. The nursery was a masterpiece of excess. Hand-painted murals of Irish landscapes, 2 cribs that probably cost more than Laura's car, and enough toys to stock a small store. But all she could focus on were the twins finally feeding peacefully in her arms, their desperate cries replaced by the soft sounds of nursing. Howard stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension that hadn't eased even after his sons had calmed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. "You said something on the train," Laura said quietly, careful not to disturb Jay as he nursed. "About traditions, about me being bound to your family. What did you mean?" Howard's shoulders tensed further, if that was even possible. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was carefully controlled, the Don's mask firmly back in place. "In the old families," he began, his voice low, "there are rules that go back centuries, ways of doing things that transcend modern law. My grandfather came from County Cork with these traditions in his blood. and they've governed our family ever since. What kind of traditions? Laura's mouth had gone dry. Howard moved closer and she noticed how he kept glancing at his sons with something almost reverent in his eyes. When a woman nurses a Dawn's heirs, when she gives them life from her own body, she becomes more than a caretaker. She becomes their mother in the eyes of the family, bound by blood that isn't blood, by a covenant older than the church itself. Laura's heart hammered against her rib. I didn't agree to... It doesn't require agreement. Howard's voice was gentle but implacable. It simply is. The moment you fed Jay and Jesse, you entered into a contract with my family. With me. That's insane. But even as she said it, Laura remembered the way Howard's men had looked at her as they'd entered the estate. Not with curiosity or suspicion, but with something closer to deference. I'm not bound to anyone. I agreed to help, that's all. You are bound. Howard crouched down beside her chair, bringing himself to eye level. This close, she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the faint scar along his jawline. And because you're bound, you're now a target. Every rival family in the city will see you as leverage against me, as a way to hurt my sons through you. The full horror of what he was saying sank in like ice water through her veins. You're saying I'm in danger because I helped your children? I'm saying you're under my protection now. You have to stay here where I can keep you safe, where my men can ensure no one touches you or uses you against my family. His hand moved as if to touch her face, then stopped. I didn't plan this, Laura, but the old ways have their own logic, their own power. My grandfather would say you were meant to find us on that train. Laura looked down at the twins, at Jesse now drowsing against her breast, at Jay's tiny hand curled trustingly against her skin. She thought about the emptiness of her apartment, the grief that had followed her like a shadow for 6 months, the way her body had betrayed her by continuing to produce milk for a daughter who would never need it. 1 week, she said firmly, meeting Howard's eyes. I'll stay for 1 week. Long enough to stabilize Jay and Jesse to make sure they can transition to bottles or find a wet nurse who can commit long-term. But this isn't a covenant or a binding or whatever your grandfather would call it. This is a professional arrangement. I'm a pediatric nurse doing her job. Something flickered in Howard's expression, amusement perhaps, or admiration. A professional arrangement, with compensation? Standard nursing rates, Laura replied, lifting her chin. Room, board, and medical supplies provided. 1 week, Mr. Myers, then I walk away. Howard studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sense he could see right through her bravado to the terrified woman beneath. Finally, he nodded. 1 week, he agreed, his voice soft. If that's what you need to tell yourself. The unspoken truth hung between them. They both knew she was already in too deep. The old ways had claimed her, whether she acknowledged them or not, and Howard Mayers had never been in the habit of letting go of what belonged to him. 3 days into her 1 week arrangement, Laura had established a rhythm that felt almost dangerously normal. The nursery had become her domain. She'd rearranged the furniture to create a nursing station by the window, organized the supplies with clinical efficiency, and even convinced Howard's housekeeper to bring up a more comfortable rocking chair. The twins were thriving. Jay had gained 3 ounces, his tiny cheeks filling out with healthy color. Jesse was sleeping longer stretches between feedings, his desperate cries replaced by contented coos. Laura tracked every feeding, every diaper change, every milestone with the meticulous attention of a NICU nurse. But it was the other presence in the nursery that was beginning to unravel her carefully maintained professional distance. Howard was always there, not hovering. Exactly, he was too controlled for that, but present, watchful. He'd arrive during morning feedings with coffee for her, the cup prepared exactly as she'd mentioned liking it once. He'd sit in the corner during afternoon sessions, laptop open but his attention clearly on his sons. During late-night feedings, he'd appear in the doorway like a shadow, as if he couldn't sleep unless he knew his children were safe. "You don't have to stay," Laura said one evening as she settled into the rocking chair with both twins. The sun was setting through the window, painting the nursery in shades of gold and amber. "I want to." Howard moved closer, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. "Is that all right?" Laura nodded, suddenly unable to speak. There was something intensely intimate about this, nursing his children while he watched, the four of them cocooned in the soft evening light. It felt like a family tableau, dangerous in its domesticity. Howard sat on the ottoman near her feet, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "You're good with them," he said quietly. "Natural. I trained for this." But even as she said it, Laura knew it was more than training. Something had shifted in her over these 3 days. When she looked at Jay and Jesse, she didn't just see patients anymore, she saw children who needed her. Children she was beginning to love. "Tell me about her," Howard said suddenly. "About Marta." The name sent a spike of pain through Laura's chest, but it was different now. Less like a knife wound, more like an old scar pulled tight. "She had your son's eyes," Laura whispered, "dark and serious, like she was taking in the whole world. She'd grab my finger when she nursed, just like Jay does." "What happened?" "I don't know. Nobody knows. I put her down for a nap, and when I went to wake her..." Laura's voice broke. "SIDS. They call it SIDS. Like that explains why a perfectly healthy baby just stops breathing." Howard's hand covered hers where it rested on Jesse's back, his palm warm and solid and surprisingly gentle for a man capable of such violence. "I'm sorry." "Loretta," Laura said, meeting his eyes. "Tell me about her." Something raw flickered across Howard's face. "She was fire," he said simply. "Fierce and fearless. She knew what I was, what I did, and she loved me anyway. Or maybe she loved me because of it. I never figured out which. Did she want children? More than anything." Howard's thumb traced small circles on Laura's hand, and she wasn't sure he even realized he was doing it. "She used to say she'd give me an army of sons to carry on the family name. Instead, she gave me 2 perfect boys and took herself away in the process." The grief in his voice resonated with Laura's own, creating a harmony of shared loss that seemed to fill the nursery. Jessie had finished nursing and was drowsing against her breast while Jay continued to feed with single-minded determination. "They have her spirit," Howard continued, his eyes on his sons. "Jessie's stubbornness, Jay's intensity, I see her in them every day, and it kills me, but it also keeps her alive." Laura understood exactly what he meant. These twins, they weren't Marta's, could never be Marta. But they were filling a void in her that she'd thought would remain empty forever. They were giving her a purpose beyond grief. 3 more days, she reminded him, though her voice lacked conviction. Howard's eyes lifted to hers, dark and knowing. 3 more days, he agreed, but his hand remained on hers, warm and possessive, and neither of them moved to break the contact. The family in the fire was already forged, whether Laura was ready to admit it or not. Laura was feeding the twins in the sunlit nursery when Howard burst through the door with an urgency she'd never seen from him. His face was a mask of controlled fury, phone still clutched in his hand, and 3 of his men flanked him in the hallway. "We need to talk." His voice was tight. "Now!" Laura's heart lurched. "What's wrong? Are we in danger?" "Possibly." Howard dismissed his men with a sharp gesture and closed the door. He paced to the window, then back, his movements predatory. "The Ferrara family has been making inquiries. About you." The name meant nothing to Laura, but the way Howard said it, with barely contained violence, told her everything she needed to know. Who are they? Rivals. They control the ports, and they've been looking for leverage against me for years. Howard's jaw clenched. Someone saw you with my sons on the train. Word travels fast in our world. They know what you are to Jay and Jesse. I'm their nurse. But even as Laura said it, she knew how hollow it sounded. She'd been here bent on days now, and she was far more than a nurse. She woke up thinking about the twins, fell asleep listening for their cries, felt her body respond to their hunger before they even made a sound. You're more than that. Howard moved closer, crouching before her chair so they were eye level. Jessie was nursing peacefully, Jay drowsing in her other arm. You're their mother in every way that matters, and the Ferrara family knows it. They know that taking you would destroy me more effectively than any bullet. Fear spiked through Laura's chest. Then I should leave, if I'm putting them in danger. No! The word was absolute. Howard's hand cupped her face with surprising tenderness. You leave and they'll track you down within hours. You stay here under my protection and I can keep you safe, all three of you. How? By making it official. Howard's thumb traced her cheekbone, his eyes intense. Tomorrow night I'm hosting a gathering of the families. All the major players will be there, Ferrara included. I'm going to claim you publicly as the mother of my sons. Once that claim is made, you'll be under the protection of every code we live by. To touch you would be to wage war on the mayor's family. Laura's breath caught. Claim me? Like I'm property? Like you're under my protection? Like you're mine? Howard's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I know this isn't what you signed up for. I know you said 1 week and tomorrow is day 6, but I need you to trust me, Laura. I need you to stand beside me and let me protect you the only way I know how. By announcing to a room full of criminals that I belong to you. By announcing to a room full of dangerous men that you are the son's mother. That you are under the protection of the Dawn. That anyone who touches you answers to me. His other hand moved to cradle Jay's head, so gentle despite the violence she knew those hands were capable of. Please. Laura looked down at the twins, at Jessie nursing contentedly, at Jay sleeping peacefully in her arms. She thought about her empty apartment, the grief counseling sessions that had done nothing to fill the void, the 6 months of walking through life like a ghost. These children had brought her back to life. And this dangerous man had given her a purpose she'd thought she'd lost forever. What do I have to do? She asked quietly. Relief flooded Howard's face. Just stand with me. Let them see you with my sons. Let them understand what you mean to this family. And after, when the week is up. Howard's eyes held hers, and she saw the truth there before he spoke it. There is no after, Laura, not anymore. You're already part of this family. Tomorrow night just makes it official. Laura knew she should be terrified. She should demand to leave, should run from this world of violence and ancient codes. But when Jay stirred in her arms and made a soft sound of contentment, when Jessie's tiny hand curled against her breast, she knew the truth. She wasn't going anywhere. Okay, she whispered. I'll stand with you. Howard's hand tightened on her face, his expression fierce and possessive, and something else that made her heart race. My queen, he murmured, so softly she almost didn't hear it. And this time Laura didn't correct him. The gathering had been exactly as terrifying as Laura had imagined. A ballroom full of dangerous men in expensive suits, their wives dripping in jewels and wearing smiles sharp as knives. Howard had kept her at his side the entire evening, one hand possessively on her lower back, the twins in their bassinets nearby like tiny princes holding court. When he'd announced her as the mother of my sons, the room had gone silent. She'd felt the weight of every gaze, calculating and assessing. But she'd also felt the shift, the way those same dangerous men had nodded with something like respect, the way their wives had approached with cautious warmth instead of hostility. She was protected now, claimed, bound by codes she barely understood, and terrified by how right it had felt. Now, hours after the last guest had left, Laura stood in the nursery watching the twins sleep, her hands trembling against the crib rail. The week was over. Her contract, her pathetic attempt at maintaining control had expired. She could walk away now, return to her empty apartment and her half-lived life. Except she couldn't breathe when she thought about leaving them. "You're thinking too loud." Howard's voice came from the doorway, rough with exhaustion. He'd removed his jacket and tie, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing more of those Celtic knot tattoos. "I should go," Laura whispered, not turning around. "The week is over. They're stable. You can find a wet nurse, someone who—" "Don't!" Howard crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand catching her wrist. "Don't pretend this is still about a contract, don't insult what we both know this has become." Laura finally turned to face him, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "What has it become, Howard? I'm a pediatric nurse who stumbled into your world. I'm a man who's falling in love with you." The words hung between them like a confession and a condemnation. "I'm a man who watches you with my son and sees the family I thought died with Loretta. I'm a man who's terrified of what you've become to me in 7 days." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs. "You don't love me. You love that I can feed your children, that I fill a need. I love that you cry when you hold them." Howard interrupted, his grip on her wrist tightening. "I love that you reorganized my entire nursery because the feng shui was wrong. I love that you argue with me about their sleep schedules and refuse to be intimidated when I use my dawn voice." His free hand cupped her face. "I love that you see the monster I am and still trust me with something precious." "Howard, you're my salvation, Laura." His voice cracked. "I was drowning in grief, watching my sons fade away, and you appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't know how to say. Loretta sent you to me. I believe that with everything I am." Tears streamed down Laura's face. "I'm scared. This world, these rules, the danger—" "I know." Howard's forehead pressed against hers. "But tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me you don't love them, that you don't love me." Laura closed her eyes, and all she could see was Jesse's smile when she picked him up in the morning, Jay's tiny hand gripping her finger during feedings. Howard's rare, devastating smile when he watched her with his sons. The way her heart had slowly, impossibly started beating again after 6 months of just existing. "I can't tell you that," she whispered, "because it would be a lie." Howard's breath hitched, and then his mouth was on hers, desperate and tender and claiming all at once. Laura's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, 7 days of tension and denial and electric attraction finally breaking free. He kissed her like she was oxygen, like she was salvation, like she was his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Howard's hand remained cupped around her face. "But stay, not for a week, not for a contract. Stay, because this is where you belong, because you're already ours to use, and we're already yours." Laura looked past him to the cribs where Jay and Jesse slept peacefully, then back to the man who'd somehow become her future. The dangerous, violent, impossible man who looked at her like she'd hung the "Yes," she breathed. "I'll stay." Howard pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like fortress walls. Laura felt his heart hammering against hers, felt the tremor in his hands that betrayed how much her answer meant. They stood there in the quiet nursery, 2 broken people who'd found each other in the ruins of their grief, and let themselves believe in second chances. The old ways had claimed her, but love had sealed the bond. The first sign of trouble was the lights dying. Laura was in the nursery doing the 2 a.m. feeding when the entire estate plunged into darkness. Emergency lights should have kicked in immediately, but they didn't. The security cameras, the alarms, the backup generators, everything went silent in a way that made her blood run cold. She'd lived in Howard's world long enough now to know what that meant. Someone had cut the power, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Laura clutched the twins closer, Jay still nursing, Jessie sleeping against her shoulder. Her phone was across the room charging. The panic button Howard had insisted she keep was in the drawer by her bed. She started to stand, to reach for something, anything. The nursery door exploded inward. 3 men in black tactical gear stormed in, weapons raised, faces covered. Laura screamed, trying to shield the twins with her body, but rough hands yanked her to her feet. Jesse woke instantly, his cries piercing the darkness. Jay unlatched and began screaming too. "Please," Laura begged, "please don't hurt them." "Shut up." The man holding her arm had an accent, Italian, she thought. One of the others grabbed Jessie from her shoulder while a third reached for Jay. "Boss wants them alive, all 3 of them." Outside, she could hear gunfire, shouting, the sounds of a battle being waged through Howard's fortress. How many of his men were dying right now trying to reach her? They dragged her through the dark hallways, the twins screaming in their captor's arms. Laura stumbled, her mind racing. She'd been claimed, she was under protection. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it was happening, and she'd been naive to think ancient codes would stop men desperate enough to start a war. They emerged into the grand ballroom where Laura had been presented just days before. Now it was occupied by at least a dozen armed men, and in the center stood a man in an expensive suit, gray at the temples, his smile cold as winter. "Mrs. Mayers," he said, though Laura had never taken that name. "Or should I say the son's mother? I'm Vincent Ferrara. Forgive the dramatic entrance." "Give me my sons." Laura's voice shook but held firm. "Your sons." Ferrara's smile widened. "Interesting how quickly you've adopted them. That's what makes you so valuable, you see. You actually love them. Love makes people do extraordinary things." The gunfire outside had stopped. An eerie silence fell over the estate. "He's coming," Ferrara continued, checking his watch. "My men have orders to let him through. I want him to see you, to see his sons in enemy hands, to understand exactly what he's about to lose." Laura's arms ached to hold the twins, who were both screaming now, terrified by the chaos and strangers. Every maternal instinct in her body was on fire, demanding she get to them, protect them, fight for them. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew. "Everything." Ferrara's eyes glittered. "His territory, his operations, his title. The mayor's empire in exchange for what he loves most." The ballroom doors crashed open and Howard stood there, alone, unarmed, his hands raised. Blood spattered his shirt and Laura couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. His eyes found hers immediately, then swept to his sons, and the raw anguish on his face nearly broke hers. "Let them go." Howard's voice was steady despite the devastation in his eyes. "Whatever you want, it's yours. Just let them go." "The Empire," Ferrara demanded. "Everything your family has built for 3 generations. Sign it over to me, and they walk out of here alive." Laura watched Howard's face, saw him weighing his entire world against 3 lives, saw the moment the most powerful Don in the city made his choice. "Where do I sign?" "Howard, no," Laura started, but he cut her off with a look. "Their lives matter more than my pride," he said quietly. "More than power, more than legacy. They matter more than everything." Ferrara produced papers. He'd come prepared, and Howard signed away his empire with a pen that probably cost more than most people's cars. Each signature was a kingdom fallen, a dynasty ended, a throne surrendered. When the last page was signed, Ferrara gestured, and his men released Laura and the twins. She ran to Howard, babies clutched against her chest, and he wrapped them all in his arms like he could shield them from the world with just his body. "Walk away, Mayers," Ferrara said coldly. "You're nobody now, just a man with a family. And if you ever try to reclaim what you've lost, I'll remind you exactly what you have to lose." Howard met his eyes steadily. "I know exactly what I have, and it's worth more than anything you just took." They walked out of the ballroom together, Howard, Laura, and the twins, leaving his empire burning behind them. 6 months later, Laura stood on the porch of a small coastal cottage in Maine, watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and rose. The sound of waves mixed with the cry of seagulls, a symphony so different from the constant hum of the city that it still sometimes took her breath away. Inside, she could hear Howard moving around the kitchen, humming softly, something he'd only started doing in the past few months, as if he was slowly remembering how to be a man instead of a Don. They disappeared the night of the assault, driving through the darkness with only the clothes on their backs and the twins in their car seats. Howard had accounts Ferrara hadn't known about, safe houses that existed outside the Empire's records. Connections who owed him personal debts rather than professional ones. They'd landed here, in this tiny town where nobody knew the name Mayers, where Howard was just the tattooed man who worked at the marina and Laura was the nice nurse who volunteered at the local clinic, where Jay and Jesse could grow up without armed guards and security cameras, without the weight of a criminal legacy pressing down on their tiny shoulders. The screen door creaked and Howard emerged with 2 cups of coffee settling into the chair beside hers. His beard was longer now, shot through with more gray. His hands, once adorned with rings that marked his status, were bare except for the calluses from honest work. "They're still asleep," he said, handing her a cup. "We might actually get to finish our coffee hot today." Laura smiled, curling her fingers around the warm ceramic. "Don't jinx it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher. This was their routine now, stolen moments of peace before the twins woke and the day began in earnest. Laura had learned to treasure these quiet mornings, so different from the chaos of the estate. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly, not for the first time. "The power. Everything you gave up." Howard turned to look at her, his dark eyes soft in the morning light. "Every day," he admitted. "I miss the respect, the fear, the certainty of my place in the world. I miss knowing I could protect you with an army instead of just my hands." Laura's chest tightened. "Howard." "But then I come home to you and the boys," he continued, reaching over to take her hand. "I watch Jay try to crawl, or Jesse smile at me like I hung the moon, or I hold you while you sleep, and I realize I didn't give up everything, and I traded an empire for a kingdom worth having." Tears pricked Laura's eyes. In the months since they'd fled, she'd watched Howard transform. The cold, controlled Don had given way to a man who laughed at his son's antics, who helped with midnight feedings without complaint, who kissed her like she was the only real thing in his world. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too." Howard pulled something from his pocket, a simple gold band, no diamonds, no ostentation, just a circle of promise. "Marry me, not because of ancient traditions or mafia codes, just because I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life knowing you're mine and I'm yours." Laura looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, then through the window at the nursery where their sons slept peacefully. The family they'd built from grief and desperation and impossible love. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Howard slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his lap, kissing her with the fierce tenderness she'd come to crave. Behind them, The sun continued to rise, washing away the shadows of their past. Inside, a twin began to cry. Jay, she could tell by the pitch. Then Jessie joined in, and they both started laughing. "So much for hot coffee," Howard murmured against her lips. "Worth it," Laura replied, standing to go to their sons. Howard followed, his hand finding hers naturally, the two of them moving toward the nursery together. They'd lost so much. Loretta and Marta, an empire and a simple life. But they'd found something worth more than either had thought possible. They'd found home. And as Laura lifted Jay into her arms while Howard scooped up Jessie, both twins settling immediately against their parents, she finally understood what the old ways had truly given her. Not a binding or a prison, but a family forged in fire and sealed in love. A new dawn and a future worth living. Okay, this story has come to an end. If it touched your heart in any way, leave a like and share it with someone who also enjoys emotional stories. New stories are coming soon. Until then, I'll be in the comments. Let's talk about this ending.